Hello everyone, and today let's talk about how China is about to remove the so-called fentanyl tariffs imposed by the US. Also, the Milwaukee Daily published an editorial saying that this time Trump has lost, and it looks more like a surrender. The first phase of the US-China tariff war has come to an end, and the outcome is quite unexpected. It ended with a major reduction in tariffs. Whether China and the US will move forward to reach a comprehensive agreement, or if the US will relapse into criticism and reignite the trade war, has drawn attention from all sides. First, looking at the outcome. China and the US reached this conclusion after just 2 rounds of talks at an extremely fast pace. So, how was the agreement reached? This agreement was something Trump desperately wanted, but at the same time, it was also an agreement that caused him to lose face completely. Looking back, on April 2nd, when Trump proposed an additional 34% reciprocal tariff on China, China immediately retaliated against Trump, and at the time, he declared that China's retaliatory tariffs were a mistake, and that China would not be able to bear the consequences, suggesting that China would panic, and that China had made a wrong move. Back then, Trump acted as if he could easily crush China, displaying an overwhelming sense of dominance. But just a few months later, there was an unexpected twist. China and the US reached an agreement, proving that China's tough stance and implementation of retaliatory tariffs was not only not a mistake, but actually a brilliant move. Now, Trump doesn't even want to publicize the China-US agreement. He immediately changed the subject. On one hand, he talked about lowering the prices of imported medicines, saying that the cost of medicine for Americans could be reduced by up to 80%. On the other hand, he shifted the blame to the European Union, claiming that the EU is even worse than China and is extremely unfair to the United States. As for expectations, the EU is likely to make major concessions to the US, because the US holds all the cards. When Trump met with reporters at the White House, he seemed unwilling to say much. Regarding the US-China agreement, he only briefly mentioned the outcome of the Geneva talks on May 12th. You could say, I think this is very good for China. It's also very good for me, and it will also be good for unification and peace. But as soon as unification was mentioned, it immediately caused anxiety in Taiwan. Everyone came up, but in reality, Trump was just making an offhand remark. Some people think that saying this will increase the chances of a phone call with President Xi, but there are also concerns that Trump could overturn the agreement at any time in a month or two. Some believe that Trump is just trying to get through early June. After the US hits the peak of $5.8 trillion in debt issuance, things could reverse at any time, and Trump might start a new tariff war with China. The second possibility is a positive outcome, where China and the US return to the negotiation table and have a chance to reach a comprehensive agreement. As for the US currently imposing a 10% reciprocal tariff on China, many believe it will be difficult to remove because it seems to be the baseline for US tariffs against the rest of the world. However, the so-called 20% fentanyl tariff that the US implemented before April 2nd is a different matter. There might be some room for flexibility there. At the press conference where no one took off their vests, fentanyl was mentioned multiple times on BT. China sent Vice Minister of Public Security and Deputy Director of the National Narcotics Control Commission, Xu Datong, to attend this meeting together, which is quite rare in negotiations and was one of the highlights of this meeting. Besender said that the US side is demanding that China punish fentanyl exporters as severely as it does domestic offenders, and went even further to say that if there is good communication with China regarding the fentanyl crisis, the US might consider removing a certain amount of tariffs on fentanyl-related products. The United States has repeatedly used fentanyl as the reason for imposing the first wave of 20% tariffs on China, but China has long since exposed this as just an excuse for the US to raise tariffs, creating the impression that China has full room to cooperate with the US on this issue. So the problem actually doesn't lie with the Chinese side, but rather with whether the US has other motives for reducing this so-called 10% fentanyl tariff. At present, there are still 2 trump cards to play. First, system regulation. Although the China-US agreement clearly states that the non-tariff countermeasures implemented by China on April 2nd will be lifted, and that China's controls on 7 types of medium and heavy rare earths were implemented after April, the mainland CCTV WeChat public account Yuyuan Talks commented on this. China's rare earth export controls are still being brought up, but rare earth controls do not fall under the so-called non-tariff countermeasures mentioned in the agreement. This is because these are routine management measures applied globally, similar to the US's chip controls, which also do not count as non-tariff countermeasures. Therefore, they are not included in the list of measures to be lifted in this round of negotiations. China's export controls on rare earths are essentially holding the lifeline of the US military manufacturing industry. The second yellow card China holds is the tariffs on US energy and agricultural products. After the agreement, anti-China voices in the US were boasting about how tariffs between the 2 countries would be reduced. In reality, the US is still imposing 30% tariffs on China, while China is only imposing 10% tariffs on the US. This kind of statement completely ignores the fact that, in addition to the 10% tariffs China imposes on US goods, China has also levied an additional 10% to 15% tariff on a range of US oil, natural gas, and agricultural products. If you add those up, plus the other 10% reciprocal tariffs China collects, the situation is quite different. So what does this mean? It means that major US products sold to China are subject to an additional 20% to 25% tariff for energy and agricultural products, which are highly replaceable. Once a 25% tariff is imposed, the US basically loses the Chinese market. On the other hand, Chinese exports to the US are less easily substituted. After adding the tariffs, quite a few imported goods may still have a market. So, the US has always wanted to use tariffs to reduce its trade deficit with China. But China would respond to the US by saying, first of all, America, your highest value, most expensive products are chips, as well as advanced process chip manufacturing equipment and other high-tech products. You're now banning those from being exported to China, too. Second, American agricultural products and energy are still subject to the remaining additional tariffs. So even if China wants to buy them every year to increase purchases of $100 billion worth of American goods, what American products are actually left for China to buy? So, the logical conclusion is that the US should further remove the 20% fentanyl tariff and relax restrictions on Chinese chips and other related products. China, in turn, would remove or even eliminate the 15% tariffs on American energy and agricultural products. Only then would China be able to significantly increase its purchases of American goods and help reduce the US trade deficit. In this sense, the US still has considerable incentive. The hope is that through comprehensive negotiations with China, there could be further reductions in the 20% tariffs on Chinese fentanyl. However, Trump is extremely unpredictable, so I absolutely cannot be overly optimistic about the future of China-US relations. The US has appointed the Director of Intelligence. On May 1st, they released a video announcing a global recruitment drive for Chinese citizens to become CIA spies. And at that time, they still said that China is the most capable strategic competitor to the US in American history. But then, just as China and the US were entering negotiations, even those who were originally quite anti-China, US Trade Representative Catherine Tai suddenly referred to China as a partner, which was quite surprising given how quickly the US changed its stance. So when it comes to the future, I can only remain cautiously optimistic. Personally, I lean slightly toward the optimistic side, because if Trump actually had any cards to play, he wouldn't have reached a major tax reduction trade agreement with China over the weekend. The truth is, Trump has no cards left, which is why, even after 90 days, he still stands alone, and simply doesn't have the ability to launch a full-scale confrontation with China. Let me talk a bit more about the trade agreement between China and the US. Most Western commentators generally see this as a typical example of Trump backing down. The headlines of their conclusions call it Trump's big tariff retreat, bluntly stating that Trump's attempt to start a trade war has already failed, and that the agreement reached with China looks even more like a defeat. Some articles from investment banks even say that this is one of the few good economic policies, almost like Trump's own Liberation Day. The tariffs that were announced were so thoroughly and quickly overturned, and what's more, Trump himself was personally involved. On the morning of December 12th, Trump agreed to reduce the high tariffs on China. This happened just a week after the decision regarding the UK. This was the second major concession. According to an editorial in the Wall Street Journal, investors might cheered for this decision. Cliff, a partner and head of policy research at the research firm Strategy Research, calculated that the rollback of Trump's tariffs would result in a significant release, roughly $300 billion in tariff reduction, which can be considered a large-scale tax cut. For major trading partners, even after the rollback, the tariffs are still relatively high. But the 90-day reprieve allows both China and the US to avoid an imminent clash that was right around the corner. Originally, consumers here would have faced the problem of product shortages, while China was worried about a rise in unemployment. The article says the same thing. Just like the US and the UK reaching a trade agreement, if the US and China reach a deal, it would look even more like a surrender by Trump and not a victory. Apart from rolling back tariffs this time, both sides have not addressed any substantive issues that affect US-China relations. They have not made broader commitments. The Wall Street Journal emphasized that Trump's chosen approach of making concessions has weakened the possibility of forming a strong international anti-China alliance. Trump imposed tariffs on allies himself, undermining both America's economic credibility and political reputation. If China can use this to prove one thing, it's that the path of the US imposing economic sanctions on China is not viable. At present, the administration has been implementing protectionist measures for nearly 4 months. And since announcing the tariffs, it has made some changes, including, first, significantly expanding the range of goods exempted from the new tariff measures on Canada and Mexico. Second, postponing the implementation of reciprocal tariffs for 90 days for all countries except China. Third, exempting some electronic products from reciprocal tariffs. Fourth, seeking to reach a trade agreement. And fifth, significantly reducing tariffs on China within 90 days. The Wagia Daily believes that, in the future, Trump may retain the global 10% baseline tariff, as well as the original 45% additional tariff on China. During the suspension of reciprocal tariffs, the United States will negotiate with dozens of countries. It may win some marginal market openings for American businesses, but so far, certain signs indicate that the substantial trade agreements Trump promised can already be achieved. After several weeks of market turmoil, the US economy still faces higher trade costs and greater uncertainty. But at least it has avoided a repeat of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act introduced in 1930. Investors, businesses, and households are pleased with this outcome, as the 2.0 version of the disaster is much milder than what Trump originally proposed. After all, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was once regarded as one of the most foolish pieces of legislation. Around 1930, when the US stock market was volatile and a financial crisis was sweeping the nation, President Hoover signed this act in order to protect American farmers and businesses from foreign competition. This act continued the previous policy of high tariffs. It raised import tariffs to as much as 60% and significantly expanded the range of tax goods to cover 20,000 items. Although this act faced strong opposition both domestically and internationally before it was enacted, it still went ahead unchanged. President Hoover's decision. In June 1930, the act was signed into law. What if the United States had managed to avoid such a disaster? Even today, a 10% across-the-board tariff would still be 4 times higher than the average US tariff rate before Trump took office. If tariffs remain high, more and more companies will gradually lose their global competitiveness. If there is any glimmer of hope amid the market turmoil, it is that the market might force Trump to wake up from the illusion that high tariffs can create a new golden age for American industry. This era didn't even last 2 months, and rather than calling it a golden age, it would be more accurate to call it the Yuan era. Now, Trump's top advisor on trade and manufacturing, the trade skeptic Peter Navarro, can be considered the architect of Trump's tariffs. However, in the latest round of high-level China-US trade talks, he was not allowed to attend the meeting, according to the Wall Street Journal's final report. Although Trump is unwilling to admit it, the trade war has already ended in defeat. He lost to Adam Smith, that is, to the economic theory advocated by proponents of free trade, and Trump is not the first US president to learn this lesson. To sum up, first, although the Wall Street Journal, as an elite American newspaper, is quite opposed to Trump, this editorial is actually written in a relatively fair manner. The agreement reached with China is even more like Trump surrendering. Having started the trade war, he has already failed. The Wall Street Journal does not support Trump, but it also does not go so far as to say that the US president has surrendered to China. Second, Trump's failure is not just about being unable to maintain. Imposing high tariffs on China is even more a serious breach of trust with allies and severely undermines the possibility of forming an anti-China alliance. This is what the Wall Street Journal regrets even more.